A play was written many years ago in memory of a long-dead Egyptian king. Two young women were chosen to play the leading roles. The play was the whim of an American writer who thought to poke fun at ancient Egyptian superstition. Legend had it that the priests of Egypt cursed their dead king to wander aimlessly through eternity. They did this by forbidding anyone to speak his name.
We call out the name Akhenaten.
That night, both women had eerie dreams about the cursed king Akhenaten. One, that she was struck across the face. In the morning, she was nearly blind. Coincidence? Or was there another force involved? A curse working its evil way after nearly 4,000 years. Egypt. It was already a great nation 3,000 years before Christ was born. Its kings built enormous monuments during their lifetimes. By the 20th century, 33 royal tombs had been excavated in the Valley of the Kings. The most exciting discovery, however, was still to come. It would be the culmination of a sequence of events that began not in Egypt, but in the green fields of England. The Berkshire Downs. Highclere Castle is the ancestral home of the Earls of Carnarvon. The lord who presided here in the first quarter of this century would help make history. It would cost him dearly, however. The Earl did not leave the comfort of his castle and embark on the adventurer's trail by choice. A curious chain of events compelled him to go to Egypt. The present Lord Carnarvon remembers very well how it began.
First of all, my father had a serious accident in Germany, a motor accident, and he was rather badly injured. He also suffered from rather weak lungs, so his doctors said to him, doesn't matter where you go, but you must go to a dry, warm climate every year from now on in the winter months. So Papa said to himself, well, that's a fine kettle of fish. He liked shooting and everything else. So he decided that he'd go off at the end of the shooting season, about the beginning of February, and he went to Egypt.
The rhythm of life along the Nile was a radical change for the Earl.
After he'd been there a few months, Lord Cromer was sent for him and said, my dear Porchy, he said, if you're coming out here regularly, you're going to be so bored you won't know what to do with yourself. So may I make a suggestion? Yes, indeed, I'd be honored if you'd tell me what to do. Right, he said, why don't you take up as a hobby Egyptology? He said, it's very interesting, and what's more, he said, it happens that at this moment of time I've got the very fella who will help you best. He happens to be an awfully nice young man called Howard Carter.
Howard Carter was an intense, driven man. After 15 years with the British Civil Service in Egypt, he'd been fired for refusing to apologize to a superior. Carter stayed on in Egypt because he had a dream. By the time Lord Carnarvon returned to England, he'd agreed to bankroll that dream. 15 years after the bargain was struck, Carter still labored in the Valley of the Kings. His dream? To find the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Professional archaeologists thought the valley had been picked clean years before. Carter disagreed. The search was exasperating. Carnarvon was threatening to cut the money off, when in November 1922, Carter unearthed a staircase. At the bottom, a door with royal seals intact. The door had been sealed more than 3,000 years before. Carter couldn't be sure he'd found Tutankhamun's tomb, but whatever lay behind the door was bound to make his years of toil worthwhile.
And at that moment, he got to the stage where he was able to see that there really was the jackpot, the hopes that they'd worked for all those years. They uncovered the steps, the first steps. And at that stage, he thought the only thing to do was to quickly cable to my father, tell him to come out, which he did.
Carter waited patiently for Carnarvon's arrival. Together, they breached the door. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asked. Then, slowly, the answer. Yes, wonderful things. Wonderful indeed. Carter's vision and Carnarvon's patience had paid off. Beyond treasure, there was the undisturbed body of a long-dead king, the resting place of Tutankhamun, pharaoh of Egypt. At last, Carter was face to face with his dream. Around Tutankhamun's neck, a magnificent gold collar. Carter recognized it as the vulture goddess Nekhbet, a warning to intruders. There were reports of another warning on a tablet that has since vanished. Death will slay with his wings whoever disturbs the rest of the pharaoh. There was little time to worry about curses. Ahead lay the enormous task of cataloging the treasure. Carter and Carnarvon were apparently not the first to enter the tomb after it was sealed. There was evidence that someone had rummaged around, then fled. Perhaps ancient tomb robbers frightened by the curse. Carter gathered up the great treasure thieves had abandoned, evidence that Tutankhamun reigned in the glory days of Egypt's past. He ruled from about 1334 to 1325 BC. Tutankhamun was 9 when he became pharaoh, not yet 20 when he died. In those days, Egypt exacted tribute from Asiatic princes and carried on an active trade with the Mediterranean kingdom of Manoah. Word of the discovery of Tutankhamun's treasure spread quickly. Tourists were becoming a problem. Lord Carnarvon returned to Cairo with part of the treasure. He had no way of knowing it, but he would never see England again. Fever, brought on by an infected mosquito bite, ravaged the Earl's body.
When I arrived, there was my father, pulse beating in his throat. You could see he very bloodshot eyes, obviously frightfully feverish and ill. So I say to the nurse, whatever happens, for heaven's sake, call me.
The young Carnarvon went to his own room as his father fought what was to be the last battle of his life.
Sure as fate, about 1 to 2, the good lady is shaking me awake, and she said, "Your father's drawn his last breath. Please come quickly."
Something was wrong with the lights, and young Carnarvon needed a flashlight to find his way to the Earl's bedside. Officially, the cause of Carnarvon's death would be pneumonia. The Egyptian press had another explanation.
Your father disturbed the remains of King Tutankhamun. He took his revenge, and he was responsible for the whole of the lights in Cairo going out at exactly the moment he died.
Lord Carnarvon was only the first of many who would die shortly after visiting the tomb of Tutankhamun. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a great event, but the sudden and mysterious death of Lord Carnarvon had cast a pall on the celebration. Carnarvon's grieving son returned to England, only to find new evidence that his father might have unleashed some malevolent force, which cost him his life. Already the popular press was proclaiming Lord Carnarvon's death to be the revenge of the mummy. His son took refuge behind the walls of Highclere Castle. The memory of that awful night in Cairo would not so easily be shaken.
I had a little fox terrier bitch called Susie. And when I got back, very old-fashioned housekeeper, Mrs. McLean, said to me, "I've something to tell you, my lord. A really extraordinary happening. At 5 minutes to 4, and as you know, Cairo time is 2 hours. So we're 2 hours in front of Cairo." She said, "Susie sat up on her hind legs. Her mouth was covered in foam. She let out a howl like a wolf and fell back dead."
Something of a panic set in. Collectors rushed to get rid of whatever Egyptian relics they possessed. Howard Carter's assistant, Richard Bethel, died suddenly of a circulatory collapse. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, committed suicide. The chief Egyptologist at both Paris's Louvre and New York's Metropolitan Museum died shortly after visiting the tomb. American financier Jay Gould took ill and died within days of seeing Tutankhamun's final resting place. To date, 22 deaths have been associated with the curse. Oxford University became the center for an exhaustive study of the relics removed from Tutankhamun's tomb, and for an investigation of the curse many now believed was real. Oxford's Ashmolean Museum is still one of the richest repositories of Egyptian antiquities. Historian Henry Lincoln is a frequent visitor.
It's very easy with our 20th century skeptical, materialistic minds to dismiss the curse of the pharaohs as absolute rubbish. Well, it is just that, absolute rubbish. Death to anyone who enters this tomb is a pretty fierce curse to somebody with a superstitious mind, but it's just a threat, and a pretty ineffectual one at that. And we all know that the curse of the pharaohs was concocted by the popular press because Lord Carnarvon had sold the rights to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb to the Times, and the other papers wanted something sensational to write about. But the Egyptians, the curse wasn't rubbish. Tutankhamun's figured largely in the thinking about the curse, and it was Tutankhamun's father-in-law who in fact was cursed to wander in all eternity by the priests of Amon.
The ram's head god, Amun-Ra, was dominant in Egypt before the reign of Akhenaten. Akhenaten introduced the practice of sun worship, symbolized by a new god, Aten. The priests of Amun were stripped of their power. Under this new religion, only the pharaoh could commune directly with Aten. The temples of Amun were defaced, but the priests bided their time. The old religion and the old ways went underground. Egypt's peasants apparently also maintained their loyalty to Amun. Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign. His tomb has never been found. Even as the young Tutankhamun was ascending the throne, the priests of Amun moved to regain their power. Akhenaten's name was eradicated from great monuments, his likenesses destroyed.
There was an American artist, Joseph Lyndon Smith, working in the tombs taking copies of the wall paintings at the time that Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. He felt it would be a good thing to intercede with the gods on behalf of Akhenaten and to lift the curse of Amon-Ra so that the pharaoh was no longer condemned to wander forever in eternity. He was going to do this by putting on a play.
The ruler is born like the Aten and will endure for eternity if only we speak his name. We call out the name Akhenaten. Akhenaten, 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 Akhenaten. We call out the name Akhenaten.
At the final dress rehearsal, something unheard of happened. At the moment when Akhenaton's own prayer was being spoken, a colossal hailstorm began. To the Egyptian helpers who were there for the play, it was as if the gods were throwing stones at them. The rehearsal had to be abandoned. The two women who were playing Akhenaton and his mother, both that night had the same dream. Each dreamt that she was standing in a temple dedicated to Amon-Ra, and the statue of the god came to life and struck them. But for each woman there was one small difference in the dream. One of the women was struck across the stomach, and the other across the face. Within 48 hours, the one who had been struck across the body was having a serious abdominal operation, and the one who had been struck across the face had the most virulent case of trachoma ever seen in a European. She almost lost her sight. Everybody associated with that little play, within that period of 48 hours, had been struck down by some minor illness or other. Was that the curse of the priests of Amon, still working after all those thousands of years? And if it wasn't the curse, what was it?
A new chapter to the mystery of the mummy's curse opened in 1976 at the Paris airport. The occasion was an eerie state visit. The mummy of King Ramses was arriving with pomp and circumstance due a chief of state. Something terrible was happening to the mummy, and Egypt wanted France to help. The mummy was taken to the Museum of Man in Paris. In a sealed laboratory, Egyptologists gathered. The Ramses mummy was among the most perfectly preserved of all those found in the Valley of the Kings. Now it was beginning to deteriorate rapidly. The Egyptians wanted to know if Ramses could be saved. Tutankhamun's mummy had been ravished by the time of its discovery. Some theorized the priests of Amen deliberately thwarted the embalming procedure. There has been no public announcement to date about what the French experts found when they unwrapped the body of Ramses. The speculation has been that a dangerous bacteria, perhaps dormant for thousands of years, is now alive and at work on the mummy. Egypt's priests knew something of biology. Perhaps they knew more than modern men imagine. In the tomb of Tutankhamun were many wonderful vessels of gold and alabaster. They were apparently designed to hold precious liquids and rare unguents. If they contained something else, something lethal, the secret died with the last priest of Amon-Ra. 1977 affords millions of Americans the opportunity to see Tutankhamun's treasures. They are on special loan from the Egyptian government and will tour museums in Washington, D.C., Chicago, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York. 55 works of art from what many consider the greatest archaeological find in history. Time has eroded much of the mystery and awe which gripped discoverers Carter and Carnarvon. The curse is probably rubbish after all. Perhaps the priests of Amon-Ra tasted enough vengeance with the deaths of Lord Carnarvon and some of his close associates. After all, Howard Carter lived out a long and happy life, and he was the first to break the seals on Tutankhamun's tomb. If the priests of Amun sought to obliterate the memory of Akhenaten and his heir Tutankhamun, they failed. Their names have been rediscovered and spoken again and again. To a pharaoh, that was assurance of immortality. Life, symbolized by the ankh. Earrings, probably worn by Tutankhamun as a young boy. The wooden figures are likenesses of favorite slaves, servants for the pharaoh in the afterlife. Other figures guarded the young king's tomb for the 3,000 years he was forgotten. If we believe the curse, we must believe something else. We must believe that in the end, Tutankhamun triumphed over the priests of Amun.
Thousands of mysterious mounds like these dot the southeastern United States. For centuries, their ghostly presence mystified all who laid eyes on them. Who could have built them? Surely not the sorry savages that the historians of the 18th and 19th centuries assumed the native population to be. A lost race, perhaps, which had come and gone before the first white man set foot on the New World, consigned forever into the oblivion of prehistory. Over the past decade, archaeologists have traced the route of the conquistador Hernando de Soto, searching for clues as to how the Indians may have perished. This painting in the Capitol building shows that romantic visions of the conquistador continue to celebrate the explorer's arrival on the American continent. But research tells a darker story. Driven by the mysterious disappearance of the mound builders, archaeologists are retracing the footsteps of the great conquistador Hernando de Soto. At digs throughout the southeastern United States, they cast new light on de Soto's route, revealing a trail marred by signs of human carnage. By the time de Soto set foot in Florida, he was a wealthy, seasoned veteran of Spanish ventures in the New World.
De Soto himself had come to the New World when he was about 14, was a big success in the terms of the day as a conquistador. He participated in the pillaging of Native American societies in Central America. He was involved with the Pizarro brothers in the sacking of the Inca Empire. He became quite wealthy.
But wealth alone could not satisfy de Soto's burning ambition. To leave his mark on history, he would gamble his fortune on one more throw of the dice, his own expedition in search of El Dorado.
When they came to the New World, none of the conquistadors came with the intention of staying. They wanted to come over here, they wanted to find El Dorado, they wanted to find the gold of the Incas, and if they didn't find that, they would go back without any kind of entitlement, any kind of status. And so they knew that, again, their backs were against the wall to make a name for themselves in the New World. And people had done it before, and there was no reason to think that they couldn't do it too.
Having plundered the great wealth of the Inca Empire, the Spanish turned their eyes northward. From there came rumors of gold, silver, and gems beyond the imaginings even of the greatest Inca monarch. In fact, a few precious trinkets had been taken from the natives of the north, but in one of the great ironies of history, the conquistadors would never learn of the true source of that wealth, their own shipwrecked galleons.
Late 1530s, wealth was going back on Spanish fleets. Many of those fleets set sail from the coast of Mexico, came around the Gulf, went down the Gulf Coast of Florida and through the Strait of Florida and up. Some of them wrecked, summer storms, hurricanes, and the Florida native people salvaged material off there, gold, silver, and in Florida archaeological sites and native sites, we do find gold and silver that came right out of Central and South America.
Spectacularly oblivious to history's strange twist of fate, De Soto's proud conquistadors arrived in the New World in the spring of 1539, probably at Tampa Bay. Almost 700 strong, they set off with haste in search of their fortunes. When they stopped to ask directions, as it were, they were in no mood to be trifled with.
Every time De Soto came to a new place, he would interrogate his captives, and the two main questions were, where is the greatest prince in the land? Where can I find the greatest, biggest, wealthiest society? And he also specifically asked Indians about precious substances such as gold and silver. The Spanish would show the Indians the jewelry on their fingers and on their bodies and would ask the Indians, where can I find this? Where can I find that? The Indians may have been tempted to mislead him, and in some cases we know that they did. But for the most part, I suspect they told him what he wished to know, because his means of extracting it were so great, and the possibility of torture was so obviously present.
In keeping with his charter from the king, De Soto read a lengthy statement to each group of natives he encountered. They and all their lands now belonged to the Spanish crown, he informed them. They were to pledge their allegiance to Spain and accept the Catholic faith.
Should they refuse, it came with this warning. With the aid of God, we will enter your land against you with force, and will make war in every place and by every means we can and are able. We will take you and your wives and children and make them slaves, and we will take your property and will do you all the harm and evil we can.
His so-called legal grounds for waging war established, Hernando de Soto set about the business of destruction and enslavement with a clear conscience. Though they came to the New World ostensibly for gold, God, and glory, the Spaniards also quite clearly came in search of slaves.
They brought leg irons and collars and chains to enslave the Indians. Probably during most of the expedition, they probably had as many Indian slaves as they had members of the expedition. So at times, the expeditions probably, they had as many people as 800, 900 people, including all the Indian slaves that were accompanying them.
One tactic used by De Soto was to capture the chiefs. The chiefs were not only economically and politically important, they were also the focus of their people's religious life.
It was devastating to the local populations when the Spaniards captured the chiefs, because it just paralyzed everyone. The population was brought to its knees almost immediately. And the reason for this is because the chiefs were the ideological centers of the universe. It was their cosmological point of contact with the other world. And why is this important? It's important because the chiefs, through their ideology, could communicate with the knowledge of the ancestors in the other world.
Until recently, our most informative sources about De Soto's Odyssey and the Indian cultures he encountered were the records and diaries kept by members of his force. Archaeologists decided to pick up the now cold trail of his expedition using these accounts.
There are actually 3 first-hand accounts written by participants in the De Soto expedition. They give almost a day-by-day itinerary. What we do then is to take those accounts and look at our maps and try and find those locales. Where is a big lake? Where is a big village? And so on and so forth. And in this way, sort of like a detective works, take a lot of little bits of information, put them together, sort of see what the best fit is. And this is how we begin to reconstruct the route.
Looking for evidence of the Spanish, archaeologists reasoned, would be the best way to find the remains of lost Indian cultures.
Within archaeological sites, we're going to see evidence at some of them of the impact of the Spaniards on the native people. And in fact, at several sites along the route, we see very graphic, horrendous evidence. Indian bones, the remains of people that lived in 1539 that have been cut with Spanish weapons.
One of the important contact sites in Florida is called Tatham Mound. Archaeologists found the remains of nearly 300 individuals, most of whom died at the same time. The cause of death was grimly clear.
But included in this group of people were bones that clearly showed sword cuts through them. One horrible one, the left shoulder of an individual cut all the way through, probably just cut the whole right arm of a person off. Some of the long bones, when the Spanish fought, it was typical for them to try and cut the tendons and muscles in legs, so your opponent fell down, and then go in and cut them in the wrist, so they drop their weapons and then go in and give them the coup de grace, either on the head or whatever. Clearly, people were killed because of these little battles, little skirmishes that occurred.
The accounts also reveal that the Indians fought just as violently as the Spanish. The witnesses record horrifying scenes. The Indians ambushed their enemies so cautiously and skillfully that not a single Spaniard who strayed so much as 100 yards from the camp escaped being hit by an arrow and beheaded at once. And in spite of great haste our men made to assist their companions at such times, they always found them decapitated.
But the Spaniards had devastating weapons at their command.
They had crossbows, they had arquebuses, they had cannon. I think good weapons. I think the best weapon, however, was the horse. And repeatedly, when the Spaniards were endangered, mounted knights on those horses could simply rout an Indian force. Essentially, a knight on a horse was the Sherman tank of the day. He had his sword, his armor, his attack dog, his war horse, pretty much impenetrable, and could attack Indians, and simply with horses, charge into them, defeat them, kill them.
The basic weapons of the Indians would have been war clubs and bows and arrows, and to some extent maybe spears, which I don't think was used very much. The weapons of the Spaniards, on the other hand, the combination of the men mounted on horses with lances and dogs was devastating.
On horseback, the Spaniards literally let slip the dogs of war.
The Indians couldn't outrun the horses, and they couldn't outrun the dogs. These dogs were war dogs. They were Irish wolfhounds, they were mastiffs, and they were greyhounds, and they were trained to kill people.
But you have to understand that De Soto and his army were here to do a job. They were here to explore, conquer, and settle. And they would stop almost at nothing to do that. Their lives were at times endangered, so they did whatever they had to do. By our standards today, their behavior was often extremely cruel.
On October the 18th, 1540, it appeared the Indians had had enough. They planned an elaborate ambush to end the Spanish terror once and for all. At the village of Movila, Chief Tuscaloosa staged an elaborate surprise attack against De Soto and his army. The Spanish slaughtered the Indians where they stood. It was a bloodbath.
The eyewitness accounts tell the tale. Women and even boys of 4 years of age fought with us. And Indian boys hanged themselves not to fall into our hands. And others jumped into the fire of their own accord. The arrow shots were tremendous and sent with such a will and a force that the lance of one knight was pierced by an arrow. We killed 3,000 of the vagabonds, without counting many others who were wounded and whom afterwards we found dead. After the battle, we rested there for a month, and we burned over much of the country.
Movila was a turning point, a death knell not only for the native people, but for De Soto's waning hopes of gold.
After Movila, De Soto, as one of his chroniclers said, began to waste life. And I think that meant life, the life of his own army, and especially the life of the Indians. And it was because he smelt failure. He smelt failure of his expedition, and he smelt ruin. He pushed his men very hard, and most particularly the Indians, and this became even more extreme in 1542 in the last months of his life, when he must have known that everything was gone, everything was lost. And at this point, he began to attack the Indians with great savagery. He would wage a kind of melee action against a village in which he would order his men to kill everybody. And the purpose was to inflict terror on any Indians who happened to hear about this incident.
Despite the advanced weaponry and savagery of the Spanish, the Indians might have prevailed had it not been for a more insidious adversary, disease. As the conquistadors marched west, they also spread deadly diseases. Epidemics that led to immense population decline spread throughout the 16th century southeastern United States.
The question of irrevocable population loss is most clearly seen, I think, in the lower Mississippi Valley, where I've done a lot of archaeological work. When De Soto comes through in 1540, there are approximately 80 villages, large villages, between like Memphis, Tennessee, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. De Soto passes through, stays there 4 or 5 months, but then passes on through. And there is no further European contact until 1682, when La Salle, representing the French, come down the Mississippi. He records only 5 villages. So the question is, what happened? What happened to the other 75? They disappeared, they died, and they likely died of disease.
As the expedition moved forward, the people and the animals they took with them, the horses, dogs, and pigs, transmitted new diseases into the susceptible native populations, and they in turn transmitted them to others.
If you think of the United States, take a major city and you reduce it by, say, 98 to 99%, you'd have an idea of how devastating it was to these societies. When they emerge, that is, when these societies, we see them through the eyes of the early English and French explorers, the whole fabric of society is completely different. These are very, very different people.
Is it possible that warfare, even between the Native American tribes, could have caused this depopulation?
The question of warfare versus disease and depopulation is an important one to look at. There's several lines of evidence that we use to say disease versus warfare. First of all, 16th century warfare is very primitive. And there may have been individual instances like Mabila, where population was wiped out. But everybody else is intact. Those are individual towns that were destroyed. Okay. With disease, however, because disease can spread between people, you would have greater destruction across a larger area of space. And wherever De Soto spent large periods of time, people disappear. And there's no way that warfare, 16th century warfare, can do that. 20th century nuclear warheads can do that, not 16th century warfare.
The depopulation of the local Indians in this area was dramatic. And one reason that it happened on such a large scale was that when people in a town were sick, everyone was sick at the same time, apparently. And so even if a glass of water would save your life, there was no one to go out to the local lake or river, get you a glass of water so that you could survive. And so having everyone sick at the same time, there was no one there to go out and gather herbs, people to go hunting, bring back game. And the villages could have had minor illnesses, and most people could have starved to death.
Within 30 years after the expedition, many of these native societies also changed. There were great social and cultural upheavals in the southeast.
The Florida Indians, of course, unfortunately, simply died out. And by about 1730s and 40s, literally what had been several 100,000 native peoples was down to handfuls. And creek Indians from Alabama and Georgia who had been raiding into Florida even in the late 1600s began to move down in and establish settlements. About 1740 they would continue to do so, but those Creeks, who the Spaniards often called cimarrones, or runaways, because they had left their native homes, later became the Seminoles, or the Seminole of today. And so indeed Florida was repopulated, at least in part, by Native American Indians, and the Seminole, their descendants, of course, live here today.
You not only have the collapse of the human population, which was certainly very important for the maintenance of the society, but you also have a tremendous loss of information. If you have 98% of your population dying, you may have a couple of percent of the population surviving, but what if all the medicine men die? What if all the shamans die? What if there are people who hold the esoteric knowledge, which is important for communicating with the other world? What if all of these people die? Then you have some real problems. You lose that continuity of knowledge.
What was here in the 17th century was very different from what was here in the 16th century. For some of the Indian peoples that De Soto encountered, the Usita, the Mocoso, some of the others in Florida, our only mention of them and our only information comes from archaeology and from what the De Soto expedition tells us.
De Soto died penniless in 1542, presumably of fever, as his army camped on the banks of the Mississippi.
For nearly a century after De Soto's death march, refugees crisscrossed their emptied homelands. New tribes and languages emerged. The collective past was lost. And by the time the English and the French colonists had laid eyes upon the mounds and asked, whose monuments were these? The descendants of the mound builders had forgotten. Only today, with the help of archaeology, are they reclaiming their lost past.